Welcome to the API Academy video series. In this video, API Change Management, we provide an overview of what API versioning is and how to approach the extending of the interface with minimal disruption to existing users. What belongs under the umbrella of change management? It includes versioning APIs and communicating what is new and what are the risks and considerations for upgrading. Providing a clear release history to easily track new and deprecated features and bugs, no matter which version a user is running. Supporting backward compatibility, or when choosing to deprecate, making the upgrade or migration process as painless as possible. API versioning has always been a controversial topic in the API design community. The short story is, if you can, avoid versioning, unless you absolutely must use it, which is rare. Why? Here is a quick test. What version of browser are you using right now? What version of HTML is the page you just loaded? What version of HTTP are you using? The short answer is, it doesn't matter. Versioning is not something that's a common part of the web. So, why there isn't the same mentality for APIs? In software engineering, there is a legitimate need to version specifically so you know which version you are running when testing, so you can roll back your changes and so on. However, from the user perspective, when we deal with interfaces, we want to hide as much unnecessary information as possible. The web is not the same as your development space, and that's okay. Versioning is not a feature, it is a tool to deal with changes. If we never changed anything, we wouldn't need versioning, but of course, things change. So, who needs to know when things change? Let's take a look. There are different conventions for versioning, and the semantic versioning approach is a good approach for code management. For code versioning, there is a major release, a minor release, a revision number, and a build number. The build number is only relevant for the build team. The revision is relevant to the test team, as they need to know about any new versions of features they are testing. The minor release number is relevant to the overall product team because they need to provide packaging around the minor release. The major release number is relevant to the integration team because they need to know how it works with the other components of the solution. But for the web APIs, users really only care if the API breaks. If you are going to implement changes, you want to minimize the disruption to your users. You should make sure that you only make changes that don't break things for your users. Postle's law was formulated by John Postle, an early pioneer of the Internet. The law was really a guideline for creators of software protocols. It says, be conservative in what you do, be liberal in what you accept from others. In a networking context, it is paraphrased as, be conservative in what you send, be liberal in what you accept. So what does it mean in the API world? Let's take a look at an example. When I send a request, I get a response back. Maybe I was expecting 3 elements, but I received 6 elements. So I'm just going to pick those 3 elements that I need. This is the best way for the API world to be working. When you are writing distributed components, you want to send information as conservatively as possible and only where it's needed. And, at the same time, you want to be very accepting of what you might receive. When you follow this approach, your environment becomes much more resilient to change over time because you can deal with unexpected elements. Some of the techniques to abide by the Postle's law are: never take anything away. Always try to preserve what you already have. Never change the meaning of existing things. Preserve the meaning. Make all new changes optional. Don't require the client to provide a new parameter or insist that they recognize new fields in the response. We call these techniques extending the interface. But, in reality, sometimes you need to refactor, which means you are going to break things. With the so-called fork mentality, you are making changes to the API, but you are in a way creating a new API. You should be clear about the versioning so there is no confusion. And you should make forks easy to identify. When it comes to the new version, make it easy to build, make it easy to test, support both versions in parallel. This is an important point because if you are going to break someone's interface, you need to give them a fair warning and time to test. Last but not least, make it as hard as possible for the users to mix up the versions. Even when you do all the right things, and you give people a lot of lead time and you make the distinction clear, be ready for users to ignore all of this. Let's take a look at a real example from the API world. Twitter's retirement of an old API version and an introduction of a new version is a good cautionary tale. Twitter announced the new version of the API. The new version was released and the old version retirement announced. At this point, both versions were maintained and supported. Tests were conducted and deadlines extended, twice. The old version of the API was finally retired, almost a year after the announcement of the new version. There were not only unintentional transition issues with the many changes in the new version. It turned out Twitter was also deliberately trying to block out some of their third-party applications. To avoid becoming this type of negative example, let's take a look at some practical examples of how to extend the interface. How do I add a new mandatory input parameter to requests without breaking existing clients? You can use default values to support existing clients. Suppose we have an issue tracking API that allows us to submit new software bugs. How do I add a mandatory field called priority without breaking applications? The server can inject a default value when applications do not provide the new field, so that issues default to normal priority. Suppose we have an API for handling product orders. What if compliance rules change and we must ask for the card's expiration date? In this case, defaults won't help, so we may need to break applications and release a new version. A hypermedia application might give us greater extensibility by being able to prompt for new parameters with a previous response. How do I add new properties to responses without breaking existing clients? Make sure that your clients ignore properties or objects that they don't understand. Suppose we have an API that provides customer profile details. What happens if we add a new property to the customer profile that the client doesn't understand? The client should ignore the new property and continue operating as normal. What if I am forced to change the meaning of something? Add a new property or object and don't change the existing one. Suppose we are retrieving a customer profile. What happens if new clients want to differentiate between a first name and last name? We can add new properties for the first name and last name without changing the existing property. Here are some tips for extending the interface. Don't overdo it. Think carefully about when you need to create a fork. And remember that Hypermedia is the most change-friendly, because there is a dialogue between the client and server that allows the interaction to be more intuitive. To sum up, only version your API when you absolutely must. When you make breaking changes to your API, treat it like a new API. And extend your interface to avoid breaking clients. You've reached the end of the video API Change Management. You should now be able to define API versioning, summarize the API versioning principles, and avoid possible issues when extending the interface. Thank you for watching. We will see you in other installments of the API Academy Learning Series.